Hello, welcome to the Invisible Night School. I am your host for today, Campbell Morera. This is an unusual episode. We aren't usually doing it on Saturdays, but because of the summer, we've been having trouble getting together on the standard time. So I've brought together, attempting to bring together some people today, Saturday. Louise is expected to join me any moment. He's running a little bit late. It's a perfect continuation of the examples that we've been demonstrating and having struggles this summer. But there has been so much interesting UFO news going on that it would have been a shame for us not to at least talk about it a little bit. I'm going to have my time distracted a little bit trying to cover the chat and talk about this subject. So everybody be nice in the chat and we should have everything move along smoothly. For some godforsaken reason, I've told people, go Grusch or not to go Grusch? Well, that's a good question. But for some godforsaken reason, I've told people in my personal life that I do this show. And so a lot of those people don't know much about UFO stuff. And I'd like to start today by talking about what's going on, why people are getting so excited about it, why people are seeing UFO headlines in the mainstream news. And that was actually what brought me into this subject back in spring of 2021 was the continuous headlines in my mainstream news feed. I couldn't understand why I was seeing this stuff. Now, today, it's almost been blown up to a bigger level than it has been before. Like 2017 was exciting, like stuff kept happening, but now it's like I'm seeing UFOs in the news constantly. The reason for that is the congressional hearings. A group of Congress members came together and they created a panel and they brought some witnesses forward onto that panel. They called them, they put them under oath, put them in front of them. We have not seen something like that about UFOs since probably around the 60s, if I'm being accurate. You know, they did some stuff on Roswell in the 90s, but it wasn't like this. David Grusch is a retired Air Force officer. He's 36, retired, I suppose, early 30s. I believe he said he was the equivalent of a colonel when he retired. Very impressive CV, put that out publicly. It's been some very interesting claims that he made on that panel under oath. He made the most notable claims he's made are the United States has some kind of UFO technology that is non-human in origin. And then he secondarily said that some of those crashes of UFO technology also involved biologics, non-human biologics. That's very interesting. It raises some serious eyebrows. Let's see if I can present here quickly. I'm going to share my screen so that we can watch him say this.
If you believe we have crashed craft, stated earlier, do we have the bodies of the pilots who piloted this craft?
As I've stated publicly already in my News Nation interview, biologics came with some of these recoveries. Yeah.
Were they, I guess, human or non-human biologics?
Non-human, and that was the assessment of people with direct knowledge on the program I talked to that are currently still on the program.
Yeah, well, that's a pretty remarkable thing to hear on a congressional panel about UFOs. Now, when we look at this information at face value, it's extraordinary and it's very exciting. I think that anybody who's a skeptic should be looking at this with an open mind. It should be taken at face value as something worthy of consideration. Myself, I would be very excited, intrigued, maybe a little scared if, there were non-human intelligences in the atmosphere and they're crashing and apparently the biologics are being recovered. Now, the implications of Grusch coming forward, the principal thing is he filed an Inspector General complaint. And that is the crux of what's going on here, is that he has a complaint going through the system that information is being unlawfully held from Congress. That is a serious claim. We know that things of that nature have happened in the past. That's just historically verifiable. There are all kinds of programs that have historically occurred. We don't know about them while they're happening. And when we find out about them many years later, sometimes we find out that criminal activity has occurred. And in some instances, that just gets ignored. Other times, there's follow-up and there are consequences. So the basic essence of Grusch's IG complaint was assessed to potentially, I think the claim was had merit. Now, that doesn't mean that the content has been found to be true yet, but it means that it's worthy of investigating to determine if it is true. That's where we're at right now. And then we have David Grusch filing that complaint with very formal language, basically saying like there are programs that are being concealed from the members of Congress who are elected. It's the law that they have to be aware to some extent of these programs. They are not being briefed on these programs. That's the substance of his formal complaint. Now, in a News Nation interview that he gave additional information related to the sort of bigger picture around that complaint. And that is where he started saying these more remarkable, extraordinary things, about there being crash technology from non-humans, biologics. It's, it's remarkable claims, and extremely unusual to hear something like this under oath in front of an official congressional body. Strange Recon Radio. Hey, how you doing, Jeff? So what we have now is somebody who is saying, a high-level individual who has a very good CV, and he's claiming under oath that there are these extraordinary things. I think that there are reasons to seriously consider what he's saying with a degree of caution. Right now, he has not publicly provided anything that the public can verify related to his claims. That makes sense. He's saying that the things that he's alleging are confidential, classified. So he's offering to provide those things to members of Congress in classified briefing rooms. On the condition that what he's saying is true, that makes sense. That would be consistent with what he's doing. Right now in the community, the UFO community, we've been seeing things that are sort of taking it to the next step, that it's as if it's already been verified that what he's saying is true. I think that gets a little bit dangerous. We have Tom DeLonge, for example. He's selling shirts now that are Tom was right, because he was making similar allegations several years ago. I don't think we're quite there yet, but we'll see what happens. If Saturday is the new Wednesday, the earth says, yeah, well, hopefully. I mean, I'm just waiting for Louise. He's sent me a big pile of notes. Maybe I'll start going through some of his notes, honestly. They were pretty good. I'm still expecting him, so we can continue here, though. So, and I'm trying to do this from the perspective of somebody who's not super familiar with this subject. All these claims sound extraordinary. We've got them in the mainstream news. If we look back on the UFO subject over the last several decades, many of the claims that Grusch is making pre-exist Grusch coming forward. And there's a substantial body of evidence that David Grusch has been interacting with the individuals involved in the UFO community who have been making these claims for many years. If the claims are true, that would be consistent with that, because as they are claiming, the reality of what he's saying, it predates his knowledge of it. However, these individuals have previously been advocating for these views for many years, and on their own terms, they have thus far failed to provide any information to the public in any way that corroborates the extraordinary claims that they make. The claims are, these are the deep programs, inaccessible. So it makes sense, if what they're saying is true, that they need this sort of really intense push from the outside to get at the truth behind the programs. Thing is that right now, it's just the case that we do not have access to that information. And what I've been seeing, even on the INS Discord, has been some pretty good conversation back and forth. Like, we have standards of evidence that typically should be, certainly when it comes to new phenomena, it needs to be verifiable, needs to be replicable, something to that effect. You have to be able to show your work. It's like when God, what was his name? The Benjamin Franklin, sent the kite up with the key and bottled electricity. He sent letters back to Europe saying that he bottled electricity, and people didn't really believe him. He explained exactly how he did it, and then they replicated it. So they didn't believe him. They did it themselves to see it, and then they saw it actually happen. That's something that we can't have access to on this subject. So then the standards of evidence, what are they if they can't be replicable, verifiable? Well, what we have is that Grusch himself and his compatriots have used personal credibility as the standard. Now, that is itself logical fallacy, right? Appeal to authority, all that kind of stuff. It doesn't really matter conceptually how talented, how smart, how experienced, whatever level of professionalism the person has. That stuff shouldn't really matter in relation to assessing the fundamental nature of reality. It does provide some insight, though. Like if a scientist said that they saw a ghost, then and they have all of the understanding of standards of evidence and stuff, then maybe you'd be more compelled to listen, even if it's technically a logical fallacy. But then, somebody takes you aside and says, oh, this person has a history of delusion, then that's also going to affect your opinion. So, there are things that will affect your opinion, even if they're technically logical fallacies. You prefer to not have anything to do with the individual involved in assessing claims of questions of fact. However, where we are right now is that that's the standard that's been set. So on the one hand, we have David Grusch. He is an extremely talented former Air Force veteran and I believe Air National Guard veteran, if I remember correctly. Excellent credentials. He was involved in very high level classified information, doing liaisoning between agencies and stuff like that. He says, and I have no reason to disbelieve him, that he was involved in preparing briefings for the president. Very high level guy. Like if somebody would have found out about this kind of stuff, somebody like him, it would, be that kind of person. Now, what we've also had are these claims, these pieces of information come forward that I don't like bringing in negativity, personal stuff. I think that it's fair, like I said, with the scientist example, that when the standard of evidence is the character of the individual as that person has set that standard, I think that then it's worthy of consideration of anything that is verifiable within that context. So what we have is that a journalist at The Intercept, I like that publication a lot. It was founded by Glenn Greenwald, who was the Guardian newspaper journalist who Edward Snowden first went to with his revelations about the NSA. Glenn Greenwald was being prevented from publishing all of the content that he felt was relevant by his editors at The Guardian, so he left The Guardian, founded his own publication. He then left that publication years later during a conflict with the editors of that publication. It's still a very solid publication. So a journalist there on Twitter publicly asked for tips about how he could get more information about Grusch. He's not saying who. I mean, as a journalist, wouldn't expect that. Somebody reached out to this journalist and provided him with a tip to file a Freedom of Information Access request in a very specific law enforcement jurisdiction in Virginia. Somebody had intimate knowledge of David Grusch's personal life and directed this journalist towards that information. What the journalist found were some police reports from, if I remember correctly, it was 2008, 2012, his first wife and then his second wife. They called the police on him on those two instances. It was alleged in those documents that he was an alcoholic, that he was violent and suicidal, essentially. The second occasion, he was brought into an inpatient psychiatric program. Apparently, he was released. We don't know what the outcome of that was. It's not fair to speculate. So that's the information we have from the public record. People are upset that that's being brought into the conversation at all. And my baseline intuition is I agree fundamentally with that. I don't like the idea that the character of the individual is introduced at all. However, because that's the standard that's been set by these individuals, because they are not providing verifiable information related to their claims and they're using their credibility as the standard of evidence, it is worth considering, if not judging the individual for what happened. You know, he's been to war. It's unclear if he's actually seen combat. The information suggests he was in the region, perhaps doing desk work, but, you know, it's reasonable to expect he saw people get hurt, die, things like that. I don't want to make any judgments about that. I think that going to war, coming back, you know, it's quite reasonable, judgment free. What happens after that? I mean, you can't be hurting people and stuff like that, obviously. But point being, these things are on the record. We can look at them. I don't want to judge the individual. I don't want to get personal about it. Just an aside, now that I'm thinking about it, I just want to point out that for a couple of years now, there have been allegations made against a couple of prominent skeptics relating to alleged domestic violence in their personal lives. Those are things that people can consider. I don't think that it inherently takes away deep platforms, especially when they're allegations. However, you know, it does bear on my character. I wouldn't personally engage with that type of individual's content because it's like separating the art from the artist. It's not really possible for me. Some people can do it, and that's fine. And if they're only making fact claims, verifiable, you know, it is a logical fallacy to be saying, oh, because this person is a bad person, what they're saying isn't worth hearing. You know, that, you know, obviously can separate those things out. But if the standard within the UFO community is people should be deplatformed if they are allegations that seem credible about violence against women, then, you know, there are some issues with Mr. Grusch on that front, it seems. So I'm just pointing out some hypocrisy here for a moment. I know that might upset some people, but I think it's worth considering that we should have the same standard for everybody. So we have Grusch. We're assessing his credibility based on the standard that we have that's been set. The characters, the personal character of the individual. We've got his extremely impressive resume. We have these things that suggest that he was going through a period of instability for several years. He presents currently as completely functional. You know, you don't see any evidence of this in his public-facing persona. So all that being said, you know, that there are good reasons to take what he's saying seriously. And then there are good reasons to think, oh, well, we should probably wait to see the entirety of the evidence before we commit to what he's saying. That's sort of the fundamental premise that I'm working off of here. Now, I'm just going to pull up some of Luis's notes because they were very good. And I'm going to have to complain to him when he finally gets here that he's showing up late because he's the one who said this. All right, let me get his notes here. Okay, let me just read his first note. The impetus for the hearings ultimately had its origins in the erroneous 2017 New York Times article by Leslie Kean, which was cited and recommended by one of the credulous committee members. Okay, well, I mean, there's a bit of, I wouldn't necessarily say the credulous. I mean, I don't disbelieve that, though. But anyway, I think it takes away from the point. The 2017 New York Times article is what started this whole modern thing with UFOs. It's a remarkable piece. It made extraordinary claims. New York Times, published in the New York Times. Leslie Kane, Ralph Blumenthal. They had a third author on there. It once again, it looked extraordinary at face value. The writing said that the U.S. government had a secret UFO investigation body, and they had these videos that appeared to show UFOs, and it was just this big thing, and it led to a huge blow up on the whole subject. Over the years, as we often have, clarity emerged, and what we ended up seeing, and this is something that I think is valid to delineate, the videos that were included in the New York Times piece in 2017, specifically the gimbal video where the guy is like, it's rotating. It seems really cool. I remember when that video came out, had never looked at UFO stuff ever. And I remember calling my brother over to the computer and being like, look at how weird this thing looks. What the heck is that? Since then, Mick West has done extensive analysis on that video. Skeptic, very prominent skeptic, probably the most prominent UFO skeptic. He has demonstrated not that it is a mundane object, but he has shown through a well-programmed computer simulation that it is plausible that it could be a mundane object. That is to say, a distant jet that is misidentified. When the option exists for it to be a mundane object, it invalidates the claim that it must be an extraordinary object. It makes the video far less interesting. So the visual evidence is always extremely compelling at face value, and then after analysis, we often see it sort of collapse through this intensive investigative process. People disagree with Mick West's, I'll just point that out right now. People disagree with his analysis. People say that it's flawed. What I would say to that is that there are grounds to believe that it has been demonstrated adequately that it could be a mundane thing. So if I'm going to steelman the UFO argument here, what I would say is this video, it's adequately shown that it could be something mundane. If we want to move the conversation forward, I think that it is justifiable to say we drop that and move on to the next thing. If that is the strongest piece of evidence available, it's not going to convince people who have a higher standard of evidence. That's my feeling. We should, just walk away from the things that have been demonstrated as being plausibly mundane if we want to argue to people that there is something fundamentally happening. So what else in that article? So Kane, and Blumenthal, they talked about this UFO program. Once you get into the details of that UFO program, at the face value, it sounds remarkable. But then when you get into it, what you find out is that it was a specific program, no bid, created by Senator Harry Reid, and the contract was received by one of his personal friends and financial contributors to the politics, Robert Bigelow. And then that program didn't just look at UFOs. UFOs was a small portion of that program. It was actually looking at all kinds of paranormal phenomena, something that Robert Bigelow has been extremely interested in for many years. So it wasn't a, top-down from the inside the intelligence community UFO program to investigate UFOs. That's what I thought initially when I read it. That's, makes sense. That's the reasonable inference. So what we end up having was just this kind of messy thing. Once you get into the details, it kind of starts looking like it falls apart. That's not to say that the subject is inherently lacking any substance. I'm just trying to delineate that when people make extremely interesting claims that seem at face value to be just like beyond argument, you end up over a couple of years and with a lot of analysis, seeing things start to fall away over and over. And to steelman the UFO point, I think that it's extremely important to embrace the fact that that is often what happens. to acknowledge, usually, yes, these claims amount to nothing, is more convincing to somebody who does not yet believe it, because it shows that there's an acknowledgement of the reality of the history of this subject. That's just my 2 cents on that. So what do we have here? How about the Schumer amendment, says Duncan in the chat. Yes, and so that's an interesting part of this. So that New York Times article in 2017, it led to a lot of interest. And then we had progressively people sort of coming forward, making more claims. And now we've sort of gotten to Grusch here. The pilots in the Navy who have said that they've seen things of note, that, from what I can tell, is the core cause of the government to actually move on this internally. Because since the 2017 New York Times article, there was that separate program through Harry Reid. Now there are 100% legitimate internal programs created by the government to investigate UFOs. We're in a new period of investigation. It's very similar to the 1960s right now. My personal analysis on this, I would advise everybody to become extremely familiar with what happened with the UFO subject in the 50s and 60s, because what's going on right now, it looks incredibly similar. And I suspect that the outcome will be similar unless there are meaningfully distinct structural reasons to cause a different outcome. In the 50s, the government started seriously investigating UFOs. In the early 50s, the US Air Force, Project Twinkle, they actually put people out in the field trying to figure out what's going on. We had the CIA do the Robertson panel after the 1952, July, Washington. There were alleged UFO flyovers. The radar was picking up stuff. People were reporting seeing things in the sky. It really got everybody talking about it. The president was demanding to know what was happening. And Churchill got the UK intelligence agencies to start seriously investigating it, figuring out what's actually happening with UFOs. The CIA put together a secret panel, Robertson panel. They did a report about it. The consequences of that ultimately was that the primary threat that they recognize always is the Soviet Union. So then you go through that. They identify in the memos that have been declassified since then, their primary concerns related to their communication channels being bogged down at a time when a major UFO event was occurring. They were concerned that people reporting UFOs, if another event like the July event happened, it caused their communication systems to collapse. And so they were saying this is actually a real national security threat, not necessarily from the objects themselves, but from the consequences of people seeing the objects. So they internally debated, should we put scientists on this publicly and like start an official reporting thing in the public? What should we do? In their memos, they're talking about this. And then they're saying, well, I don't know if we want to actually put scientists on this publicly, because then it's going to increase attention. And then that might increase the odds of what we were worried about happening. More people thinking about UFOs, reporting UFOs. So they actually had this debate back then. And they ended up doing the Air Force. They did go into, the CIA basically handed it off. The US Air Force was entirely the lead on it. They did do a UFO investigation program that was publicly accessible. That we don't have that now, but it was people could get UFO reports submitted. Credible professionals would come. The lead investigator, Dr. J. Allen Hynek, he was the chair of Northwestern University's astrophysics department, as astrophysicist himself. He became very involved in it. So as the subject kept going into the 50s, into the 60s, what we had was being a very popular subject. And Congress people started to take note because of the popularity. And they were also curious, what's going on? What are people seeing? In the original congressional investigations, the person who primarily was involved was an individual known by the name of Gerald Ford, who later became president, not by election, but he was Nixon's vice president. And then when Nixon had to resign, Gerald Ford became president. But so the last time that Congress led UFO investigations, the person who was centrally responsible became president. So, there might be something there about these people stepping in and taking a look at this seriously from Congress, because, that's a notable history of what happens when you look into UFOs potentially. So what happened was the U.S. Air Force ultimately decided in the mid 60s that they were going to sign off on, finally try to drop this, reduce it public interest by bringing in an independent committee of scientists from the University of Colorado. They commissioned the Condon report. Edward Condon is a scientist there. That report was completed in 1969. It wrapped up Blue Book and the government's involvement. That independent committee of scientists who were commissioned by the U.S. military establishment to wrap up the UFO investigations. Now, what do we have? We have the independent NASA UAP study group. So we have an independent body of scientists in the current day who has been commissioned to take a look at this from the outside. They're preparing a report. The effect last time in the late 60s of the report was to say there is no evidence of extraterrestrials to the extent that people are seeing phenomena with extraordinary features. What's the language? The National Academy of Sciences review says there are important areas of atmospheric electricity that came to our attention in relation to some UFO reports. These are being currently actively investigated by the Department of Justice and NASA. What we see in the contemporary today, NASA declassified memos from the UAP study group, John Greenwald, I believe, FOIA'd those. We have Dr. Spergel, I believe he's the chairperson of that committee. He is talking about in these memos that he thinks that the number one thing is misidentifications, and then the second thing are atmospheric electric phenomena like skyrmions and things like that. It's kind of like three-dimensional energy whirlwinds that whatever that can potentially form in the atmosphere. Apparently, there is evidence from labs that those are reproducible on command in labs. You can make those replicably, so they probably exist in nature. They seem to be suggesting that's what they're looking at. Now, when that report came out, the main thing was no evidence of extraterrestrials. Excuse me. Everybody who's interested, well, not everybody, a significant body of people who are interested in the subject want there to be extraterrestrials, or at least non-human intelligence of some kind. So when the report comes out from the independent scientists, no evidence of extraterrestrials, people lose interest dramatically. That's just a natural consequence of that. We don't have the report from NASA yet. My suspicion is that something kind of like that is coming around. I don't think that it's a false thing either. I think that the evidence, it doesn't really matter what I think, the evidence historically shows that those commissions, there were issues with the credibility, but there was also extremely legitimate science that was done. It was taken very seriously. There is often a claim that the government and scientists have not taken this subject seriously. The documented historical evidence shows that it has been taken very seriously, both internal to the government and by these independent scientists. If the NASA study group results in some kind of similar report saying no evidence of extraterrestrials, and we're already getting that from the existing agency looking at UFOs, Kirkpatrick, the director of that, saying no evidence of extraterrestrials, Air Force saying no evidence of extraterrestrials. Once that NASA panel group, a UAP study group report comes out, and if it is saying something similar, we're probably going to see something similar to the late 60s. The news is going to once again fade out. This is where David Grusch comes in. If he is actually doing what he is saying, that is to say, he is actually providing what did he say in the committee under oath? He said he has the exact names of the people currently working on the exact programs that are reverse engineering non-human technology and with access to non-human biologics recovered from crashes related to non-human technology. If he actually has those names of those people in those departments, that could be the thing that separates this fundamentally from these historic examples of these investigations. We don't yet know if that is coming or not. There's reason to be hopeful, but there's not reason to assume that it will happen, kind of like Tom DeLonge with his Tom Was Right t-shirt. And Grusch has lists of names, places. Yes, exactly, Duncan. So he's saying that he has the exact people who are on the active programs on the condition that he is providing those exact names to these Congress people, and these Congress people do move forward on investigating that. Then there will be something that comes from this that could be historically significant beyond what already is. It already is historically significant. Personally, I think that there's a lot of value in tempering our expectations around this subject based on the accessible history related to declassified internal briefing reports at Western intelligence agencies that we have access to, specifically Five Eyes. What we do have that can inform us on what the internal true assessment is of what's happening. We have access to documents from the CIA, the US Air Force, and the UK Ministry of Defense related to this subject. These are documents that are completely from the original sources, from the archives. In the case of the UK Ministry of Defense, reported on by The Guardian, BBC News, and Wired. The reports from US Air Force's Project Blue Book that were classified, there are some very interesting reports in there. One of them that I'll note is Leveland. Another one is Minot. In those two reports at the time that were classified, the US Air Force investigators actually came to the conclusion in those reports that objects with the fundamental features that are reported by historical UFO eyewitnesses were observed. So they say that those objects were actually seen at that time. That's very distinct from what we see today from people saying stuff. What they say is that those objects were actually potentially physically real objects that were observed with these remarkable features that were reported in those instances. What the investigators concluded was they may have been observations of some kind of ball lightning phenomenon. UFO, whatever you want to call it, truth seekers, believers, advocates, will argue, well, not without bad reasons, that is a way for somebody to essentially sweep this under the rug. They would say that, yeah, that could explain a small portion of some observations. However, we're talking about the genuine anomalies that are not ball lightning that make up the tiny percentage of actual flying saucer reports. Now, what I'm actually trying to convey here is the US Air Force declassified reports indicate that the US Air Force believes internally that those objects, the flying saucers, are the tiny portion that are actually ball lightning. That doesn't mean that that's true, and we can't verify that in any way. But it's quite interesting to think, oh, the documents show that that's what they believed internally. Let's see here. Saying something could be explained by ball lightning is pretty much the same as saying it's unidentified. In some ways, the Earth, that's true in some ways. In other ways, it's a very meaningful distinction because ball lightning is verified to exist in nature and it is a lab reproducible phenomenon. So, like we were talking about with standards of evidence before, when somebody's making a claim about seeing something that we know does exist with the same features, as something that we don't know exist with the same features, there, on a balance of probabilities, there's value in making that delineation and thinking, well, there are actually some reasons to potentially listen to that. That said, it's not verifiable. My point here is that we have records that demonstrate that the Air Force concluded fundamentally the objects in question, flying saucers, may actually exist in the atmosphere and be these phenomena. Like I referenced briefly before, that was the conclusion of the Condon report as well, and the National Academy of Sciences review. And then in the modern declassified NASA memos, they're referring to the same thing, like electromagnetic vortices. And those things conceptually have similar or the same features as many of the most credible, most unusual, whatever, UFO observations. So that doesn't mean that that is literally what it is, but there is good reason to think that that's what some of these intelligence agencies believe what is actually happening. Now, the most interesting report that we do have, perhaps the most interesting, is the most recent one that is from 2000 UK Ministry of Defense report. It's been verified as a genuine internal briefing report by BBC News, The Guardian, Wired. It was declassified in 2006 through a Freedom of Information Act request by Dr. David Clark, an associate professor of journalism and folklore at Sheffield Hallam University in, I believe, Kent, UK. And that report says essentially identically. It describes briefing the top leadership of the Ministry of Defense, UK leadership, UFOs as flying saucers, fundamentally these objects with extraordinary features. It's the quote from the intro is like, lights of various colors hover, land, accelerate instantaneously, outmaneuver any known aircraft or missile, all this stuff. It says that those objects indisputably exist, and that the scientists in the Ministry of Defense are almost certain that they represent electromagnetic vortices in the atmosphere, these strange phenomena. That doesn't mean that that is what's happening, but the evidence shows that that's what the top intelligence agencies have been briefed by their administrations as to what's happening. That's pretty interesting. So what we have is people are saying, well, the ball lightning thing, that's always just been a way to sweep this under the rug. Now that we have verification in the scientific community that ball lightning is real and we can reliably reproduce it in labs, is it sweeping it under the rug? If we look at it and it has fundamentally the same observable features as what people are saying are flying saucers, I mean, that's pretty interesting. I don't know. Doesn't mean that these intelligence agencies are right in their conclusions. We don't have access to the information that they used to arrive at these conclusions. What it does mean is that that may be, or there are compelling reasons to believe that that may be the belief system governing the behavior related to this subject. Let's see here. Luis Tano is stuck in a Wendy's drive-thru. Yeah. Well, hopefully he's. I mean, it's getting on. I would have expected him by now. I'm gonna have to really give him a firm talking to after this. Let's see here. The Earth. Where can I find it? Oh, you're talking about something else. Okay. Anyway, so this report from the UK, pretty interesting. So let's say, okay, so what we see is that the report is telling leadership these UFOs being observed, they're fundamentally real objects, and we are almost certain that they are ball lightning. So that's what the leadership at the UK Ministry of Defense has been briefed on. That's verified. That's 100% confirmed. So the UK leadership is operating under that premise that these things are being observed are ball lightning. David Grusch, this is where it gets really interesting. He's arguing there are UFO reverse engineering programs in the United States, and they're being illegally hidden from Congress. Is there any evidence available in the public realm to suggest that there are UFO reverse engineering programs in existence in Western intelligence agencies, ministries of defense? The UK UFO report we have access to, unidentified aerial phenomena in the UK air defense region. That report details specifically that the top technology managers at the Ministry of Defense have been briefed that this is what's going on, and they have started reverse engineering programs to try to develop these phenomena into a variety of different weapon systems. And they mention all kinds of things like radar decoys, energy production, all kinds of stuff related to UFO lore, except these are found in a official report that was used to brief UK top leadership. So what we have is an interesting narrative where declassified official reports in the UK National Archives show conclusively that UFO reverse engineering programs are real. Definitionally, the UK, within their own report, say they have UFO reverse engineering programs. The only thing that's different is that the UFOs, they are defining them as these objects, flying saucers with the features of like the remarkable UFOs. They're not just saying UAP are real because anything until it's unidentified could be a UAP. They're saying, no, the objects that are discrete, flying saucers, are real, and they are these ball lightning. So they are doing reverse engineering on that. And so when Grusch comes forward and he's saying there are UFO reverse engineering programs that are being hidden, it's not too much to think, perhaps, that he's got part of the picture. Maybe there are these programs. We know the UK has them. Like, how much bigger is the United States' budget militarily than the UK? Is it? I mean, I can't even. It's like $850 billion is the United States this year. I'm not going to look it up. It's a tiny fraction in the UK. It would be remarkable in many ways if the United States did not have these programs. So one way of looking at what's happening right now is that David Grusch has gotten slivers of information about these UFO reverse engineering programs, reasonably, in some ways, presume that they're extraterrestrial, or at least once he looked into it more, he's talking to other people who believe that they're extraterrestrial. And then you get into it, and then maybe this is going to resolve closer to what the internal briefing reports have been telling their top leadership for many years than the undemonstrated to exist side of things. Or maybe it's something truly remarkable. It's worth noting that based on the standards of evidence we have for novel natural phenomena that especially are extraordinarily rare and transient, if UFOs are a non-human intelligence of some kind, the way that they are being observed or reported to be observed now would be very consistent with other kinds of phenomena that were not previously recognized to exist and then became known to science. So what I'm trying to say is something like rogue waves. Very interesting history there. Sailors for many years were reporting observations of rogue waves. They were trying to take videos showing them stuff like that. It was hard to tell, like, relative to everything else, what was going on. Based on the physics calculations that were made by the experts at the time, this would be the late 90s, prior to that, the physics required to create a rogue wave would only be likely to occur approximately once every 10,000 years. So somewhere in the world, in some ocean, once every 10,000 years, there would be a rogue wave, a huge wave that's just statistically extremely unlikely. In the mid-2000s, Europe sent up their ocean observing satellite. I can't remember the name of it right now, but it takes imagery of all of the oceans on Earth. And what it found was multiple instances of rogue waves occurring every single year, adequate to explain these observations that were being reported, that were not being believed, because the science seemed to show that it was not consistent. The observations were not consistent with the expected behavior of this phenomenon. So, there are good reasons in the natural sciences to not throw away information that suggests there could be something genuinely novel occurring. And what I'm doing right now is I'm trying to validate sincerely that there is reason to be interested in the possibility that there could be something more going on than simply a natural phenomenon. That said, right now, all of the publicly available information, including the declassified reports and the science, suggests that there are sufficient plausible explanations that could account for all of these things. And so both things could be true. And that has been the same as in history, where when a new thing is found, there are almost always sufficient plausible reasons to think it's more likely that it's not something extraordinary and new than it is something extraordinary and new. And therefore, on a balance of probabilities, every single time you have to reasonably conclude it's more likely to be the thing that is already known than a new unknown. However, there's an interesting thing there, whereas it's obvious, clearly, there are novel things that end up being true. And so based on that standard, you never find out anything new. So you always have to be looking and taking extremely seriously these outliers, these outside the norm data points, in order to move forward in our understanding of the natural world. Okay, well, so that's pretty much my point there. Still don't have Louise. It's been almost an hour. My goodness, I have just been going on. But you know what? I have a fair bit of experience going on about this. My wife is quite familiar with all of these things at this point. So and I'm sure she would tell you I could just continue on for hours and hours. Now, let me go through the comments here briefly and just see if there's anything that we could talk about here. After all, violent primates, just down from the trees. Of course, we try to weaponize everything. 100%. They're, I mean, everything is weaponized initially. Okay, a good example of this, the jet stream. The jet stream, when it was first discovered in, what was it, the 30s? It was top secret classified because they were trying to weaponize it. It's every single time this is what happens. So it should be the norm, should be what's expected. What happened with the jet stream when it was still classified is the Japanese scientists in World War II were weaponizing it themselves. And what they successfully did, in a limited sense, was launching dozens of these incendiary balloons all the way up to the jet stream. And they used the physics calculations to determine how high they had to go into the jet stream and how far the jet stream could carry them. So they were able to launch balloons from Japan, and they actually had a couple of, I think, one verified successful hit on the US mainland. It was not effective in terms of the actual consequences physically, but as a terror tactic, it did work quite well to make people afraid of these things. And the fact that it was possible at all was due to top secret weaponization of newly discovered natural phenomena. So we have a long history of this kind of thing happening. Let's see here. Ball lightning might not even fit the category of object. Well, that's an interesting take. It depends on how you define it. I've argued with people extensively about whether ball lightning would be a physical object, because it moves, it can move in near instantaneously because it's basically it's energy traveling around and it's ionizing the air around it. So what you're seeing from the light, it's not like the object itself, it's actually the atmosphere being energized as the vortex travels through it. The science, the way that they define it, is that it is a physical object because it is made up of ionized aerosols. It's made up of particles of material in the atmosphere that get a high energy injection into them, and then they turn into the vortex or whatever. So it is a physical object, but it's not a solid object. So it gets a little complicated. I've had that conversation many times with people because it's counterintuitive. It totally is. And it can look physically solid as well, allegedly. Okay, let's see here. What else we got? Okay, not all these things. Ball lightning is known to exist, but it's not understood how it works or how common it is. 100%. That's accurate. It seems based on the lab reproducible studies, it seems like there are actually many different forms that it can take. It's extremely poorly understood to what extent those forms can occur naturally in the atmosphere. It is a very challenging subject, and it's hard to know exactly what's happening with it. I think that's extremely important to keep in mind. Let's see here. Bring on the wife. Maybe one day. Okay, Steve. Condign is definitely an interesting briefing report, but it would be nice to know more about it, like its provenance and the authors, especially considering some of the briefing reports we've seen from BAASS, etc. That's a good point, Steve. Anybody who doesn't know Steve Long, follow him on Twitter at UAP or SAP. He just has phenomenal takes. I agree with essentially, well, most things he has to say. What he's saying here is an excellent point. I agree entirely. I was emphasizing that we don't know if the report's conclusions are true, but we do know that UK leadership was briefed on them and it was used to close their program because they accepted the conclusions in that. So it could be another example of one of these things where leadership was misled unintentionally, conceptually, by a believer that this is occurring. So that's a very good point. You have to keep that always in mind. That could be the case. The fact that investigators in the other agencies we have declassified reports from suggest that similar conclusions were reached, I find that interesting as well. But once again, it could be exactly the same thing. Human minds are not super discrete. It could easily be the case, and has been in many instances over many different subjects. People have the same thought completely independently. More about it, like its provenance and the authors. The author has been studied. He has been found. David Clark, Dr. Clark, I believe, identified him. I can't remember his name. He was the top radar expert in the Ministry of Defense. He also has some troubling elements to him, this author. If I remember Dr. Clark's information correctly, he is involved in this. Once again, this is sort of like an ad hominem type thing that maybe is or isn't relevant. He was involved in some kind of very specialized small Christian denomination with rather extreme worldviews, and that has been used to call into question his capacity to assess evidence and things like that. You know, it's such a serious subject. It's fair to bring that in. It's better to, I mean, if that is known, it is better to have that information available than not. And I believe that Dr. Clark has even reported that this individual has made trips specifically to events like where he presents things since he published this report internally. I suppose since it got declassified in 2006, he can talk openly about it now. I don't know how that works. But he has been verified to be in attendance, giving a speech at least one time at an event in Israel where he broke down the report to the audience and spelled out all of the things that I'm talking about, that flying saucers are fundamentally real objects, that they have these features, that there is the potential to weaponize them in these various ways. And even the report even says it even explains it explains everything really. And it's interesting because it's the way that you would expect a government to function. So often in this subject, you're told like, oh, the government doesn't take it seriously. When you're looking at this, it's like, oh, the 30 years of collecting everything. We're looking at everything. We're really thinking about it. And then they're saying, effectively, we don't want to talk about this publicly because we think that Russia might be ahead of us on this particular kind of science. So we really want to just keep sort of this locked up under wraps until we figure this out. That's what he says in there. Maybe that's not true. I don't know. I mean, it's true that it's in there. I don't know if that's, the case or not. So let's see here. So yes, so Steve, yeah, it's valid to consider, there are problematic elements with the author. That's a very good point. Let's see here. The plasmoids have Louise held hostage. Well, maybe. At this point, I believe anything, really. Let's see. Condine's conclusions were really speculative. I would agree with that because, well, the problem is that we don't have access to the science that the author used. He said he used the last 30 years of MOD data as well as the relevant scientific principles. It's a good point. We don't really know what the heck that means. Could easily just be purely speculative from what we're seeing. The interesting part is that internally it was seen to be compelling enough to influence top-level, top-down policy about UFOs. So I think that's pretty interesting. Let's see here. Ellis Battle of Los Angeles. Well, yeah, maybe. Yeah, the whole thing where all of the air defense cannons were going off like crazy on that one particular night, aiming at some kind of object is considered potentially to be a UFO in the UFO community. Could easily have been some kind of balloon. Absolutely. Let's see here. Ball lightning. They have produced masses of plasma in the lab, but not well-defined buoyant object-like phenomena. They have not produced buoyant object-like phenomena independent of an external energy source. If it's within a microwaved region, you can have a consistent object form with whatever. You can sort of see it consistently hold itself together and stuff like that. There are some videos and stuff on my website, but it's a good point. Like it's not like we have conclusive video of an object looks exactly like how people are describing the Tic Tac or something, but we do have our high speed cameras taking photos of these plasmoids formed in the lab, and when they are forming, you can see them form exact white ellipsoids. Effectively identical to the Tic Tac visually. That doesn't mean that is what that is. Pretty interesting that it does in the lab produce an identical observable sort of profile. Let's see here. Duncan, any predictions about the next public fallout from the hearing? Will Burchett al. reveal things heard in SCIS? I do not think Burchett will reveal things heard in the SCIFs, the rooms where you get the classified information, the secure rooms. Public fallout from the hearing. Well, if we look at the history, which is what I was sort of starting with, I think that the hearings are going to continue to increase public interest, and that is what we're seeing. Now, where is that headed? It's a great question. Like the UAP study group from NASA's, their report will be published relatively soon, I imagine. And then it's going to be very interesting because that will effectively mimic the Condon report, except the Condon report was tainted with all of these early memos that showed that the Air Force was basically asking the lead scientist to take into consideration the relevant national security issues that they had defined related to overhyping the subject. That, so you hire the independent and then you're influencing the independent. Of course that looks bad, and it is bad. We don't seem to have that right now. I mean, once again, we can't. I mean, even then, actually, we have the declassified memos that Greenwald got, and they seem to be taking quite seriously. So if that report from NASA comes out and they say something very similar to what the Condon report said, effectively, like no evidence of extraterrestrials. However, there are reasons to think that there are relevant principles of atmospheric electricity that may come into play in some of the most exceptional UFO events, and the Department of Justice and the, oh my goodness, Luis Satano is joining us. My friend, let me bring you onto the stream here. Luis, hello.
Hey.
You're joining us. Thank you, my friend. How are you?
Not bad. Sorry about that delay.
Oh, no problem. No problem. Were you listening at all, or are you just hopping on?
I just had one little errand that got stretched out, but
Yes.
what were you saying? Sorry.
Oh, I've been saying so much. No. I was basically summarizing the history, talking about the similarities to Blue Book and the Condon Report and stuff
Mhm.
like that. People were asking a little bit about, I was doing my usual shtick about ball lightning. And then people were sort of asking about the fallout from the hearings. Louise, maybe you could provide some commentary on that. What do you
Yeah.
think the most significant fallout from these hearings occurring is going to be?
I think the biggest fallout is going to be when it turns out to be another disappointment,
Hmm.
and then I don't know. I think the disclosure narrative will still keep going, but it'll take a major hit.
Okay. Yeah, and based on your knowledge of the historical cycles in this subject, if it takes a hit,
Hmm.
would you expect it to sort of come back again? Do you think there's any way in which this could actually get resolved in some sense?
No, I don't think it'll ever be fully resolved because, like, we're not going to get taken to Area 51. And, the government like lifts up like in Wizard of Oz, the curtain with the wizard. They're not going to do that. So like I think there's always this sort of potential for it to just keep going because there's always going to be secrets that the government keeps for national security reasons. But I think it'll come back, but I don't know in what form. A lot of it is going to depend on sort of the social climate because as one thing that I've noted is that the hearings are taking place in a sort of a backdrop of attacks on consensus reality, and there's a lot of fake news as well, and just a general distrust of the government. And some of the committee members are kind of credulous. They're not really attacking the problem, from the viewpoint of like seriously questioning Grusch's claims to get to the bottom of get to the bottom of it. It's more like a kind of just a credulous acceptance of what he's saying.
I think there's a big issue with how, I mean, it's sort of funny, but it's like how popular the subject is. It does lead into these problematic elements. I was referencing how Gerald Ford was so heavily involved with the original in the 60s, the investigations through Congress, and that he became president later, and maybe that would influence some Congress members potentially. I'm not saying that's necessarily the case, but there's reason to believe that could be a factor in leaning into this subject and in the way that we're seeing where it is not being actively criticized too heavily. We saw Ryan Graves, a former Air Force pilot, on there. He's now the the director of the that organization he founded, where airline pilots, all kinds of pilots, can report UFOs. They're trying to advocate for more airplane safety in relation to UFOs. In the hearing, he was under oath, and I was very shocked to hear him suggest under oath that he has personally seen UFOs, because he has repeatedly stated explicitly that he never saw a UFO personally, but that he was flying with many people who told him directly that they did see it. It's a meaningful distinction, very meaningful. What was your takeaway from that?
So he actually said he saw one now?
He responded to the question. I'm gonna have to find it, but yes, the question that Fravor and Graves responded to, the seeing the UFO, whether it defied physics, and then Grusch responded to it saying he has not seen a UFO, but Graves responded in the way that he had seen a UFO.
Oh, possibly Graves.
Okay, we're seeing. Graves said we, not I. Okay, so
Yeah.
sort of in the language, the implication is there that he
His
he
colleagues.
was speaking for his colleagues. He's not talking about
Yeah.
himself. Oh,
But-
okay.
Hasn't he also alluded to seeing UAPs on footage, like after a flight or a mission?
Graves himself, that is possible. I'm pretty sure. I mean, that was definitely an element of the Nimitz Tic Tac, was that they brought back the video of Underwood after his rendezvous, and they were looking at it, and that Fravor was saying that's when he saw the little feet underneath it. He didn't see those when he was like with the object himself. He saw that on video. So that has been an element of some of these observations.
Oh, and by the way, I just I see Fringe Quest in the chat.
Yes.
He actually believes that UFOs are Uruguayan drones.
Okay.
That's pretty interesting.
Did he write that in the chat, or that's just from Twitter or X exchanges?
I'm actually kidding.
Okay, you're just
No,
trolling him.
Yeah, it's like a ongoing.
You're
joke
starting
between us.
fake news here.
I just thought I'd sneak in a little bit of fake news.
Yeah, just a touch. Okay. I was looking through your notes, actually. I started to read through them briefly there. I was I like the essence of them. Let me just look here quickly. One of them you say you point out in one of them the former Navy pilots, their testimony, Graves and Fravor, it didn't specifically affirm Grusch's claims of captured ET technology.
Yeah.
And that Grusch's statements themselves have problems. Would you be able to spell out for me what the biggest problems you see with Grusch's testimony relating specifically to like crashed non-human technology and non-human biologics is?
Yeah, for one thing, it kind of is continuous with dubious stories like Roswell. And in fact, one of the committee members did cite Roswell as part of like the history of the whole, this genre, whatever you want to call it. We know that it was probably a mogul balloon. So already like dubious history is being cited in support of the Grusch case. And sorry, what was the other part of your question?
Just the biologics and like
Oh,
what
the
issues
biologics.
are. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a trope that has been going on for a long time about captured ETs. But no, I mean, just the biggest problem is that no, demonstrable evidence has ever been shown for that. But I mean, Grusch himself is pushing a certain narrative about the Magenta case. I don't know if people know about, have you talked about that yet?
I have not. Which one is that?
Oh, that's the 1933 Italian,
Okay.
recovery supposedly of
Yeah,
a
so
craft.
let's get into this because this is my thought. Like when somebody is making claims of this level and I want to believe them, if I want to steel man them, why, for the love of God, would you be leading with
Mhm.
cases that are so problematic? Okay, maybe you could explain this case to us a bit.
Yeah, so the case is actually an embellished and garbled story because there was an original version and then there was another version, which the one that we're getting now and which is being conveyed also by Lou Elizondo, who probably is the one who passed it on to Grusch because Grusch, has met with Elizondo. And also Grusch did go to Italy and I think he met with an Italian ufologist there who probably also gave it to him. But this story originally was just, and it was already dubious from the beginning, I think. Like it's not for certain that the documents are real, but it talks about a craft, which could be an aircraft from another country, being captured by the government of Benito Mussolini in 1933. And it was later on picked up by William Brophy Jr., who is also involved in the Trinity case. And so, that's already a big red flag. But this guy's been involved in like fabricating and concocting and embellishing stories for a long time. and he did the same with the Magenta case. He added on some elements to it, such as that two Nordic kind of tall white aliens or beings were recovered, that it was an acorn-shaped craft. So it's been linked to the Glocker story, the Nazi UFO, and that it crashed specifically and that it was recovered. And then it was eventually captured by American forces towards the end of World War II, apparently with the help of the Vatican. And it was then taken to the US, presumably for further study and analysis. So like those elements are completely made up, but they have made their way into Grusch's claims. He actually was speaking to a foreign or a French newspaper called Le Parisien. And you can find the interview online. It's in French, but you can find an English transcript as well. He repeats that story. And so already we're seeing demonstrably fake stories being part of the repertoire of his, overall claims. And that's really problematic. So you've got Roswell as a kind of a backdrop. You've got also the dubious 2017 New York Times story by Leslie Kean. Also was mentioned affirmatively by one of the committee members, and actually acted as a kind of springboard for this whole thing, like the initial impetus for this whole push by Congress, or in Congress by certain UFO advocates like George Knapp and Jeremy Corbell. Arguably all started with that 2017 story. And you've got these fake stories like Magenta. Now, I don't think that Grusch is lying, but I think that, Steve Cambion on his show recently, actually, he mentioned that Grusch is autistic. And that is actually relevant.
Is that verified, just to be clear?
Well, I think he himself has said that he's
mentioned
autistic.
it?
Yeah,
Okay.
if I'm not mistaken. But ASD, some scientific studies have noted that people with ASD are more or less able to discern whether other people are lying to them. So that means that, in other words, you're more open to manipulation, which is a very important thing for an intelligence officer, right? If he's assessing other people's extraordinary claims and passing them off as trustworthy, then, that's obviously relevant. And that's going to have to count as a point against them. Nothing to do with, being against people with autism or denigrating them. It's simply that scientific studies have shown that, in fact, people with autism are more open to manipulation. So that we have to take that into account.
Right. Yeah. And so this is something similar to what I was talking about near the start of the show. I was talking about how it's not ideal. I don't really like how the individual's traits and stuff are an element of the conversation. However, because the information itself is not accessible to us, that's being alleged to exist, is not verifiable, and Grusch and his associates have used Grusch's credibility as the standard of evidence that we need to cite until that information comes to light. This is sort of the kind of thing where it's worth being aware of. It's also worth remembering that, appeal to authority, ad hominem, those are all kind of like logical fallacies. So some people saying he's a veteran, listen to anything he says. Other people saying throw out everything he says because he's got these arrest records. We can't be leaning into one or other of those, but it's all relevant to consider.
Yes, of course. And on the issue of PTSD and the alcohol problems, I don't know if you talked about those already.
I did briefly, yes.
But let me just add maybe to that by
Yes.
saying that that is also relevant, but in a more indirect way, because people with those problems may be seen as a security liability by their superiors, because the intelligence that they are entrusted with could be compromised, or they could find themselves compromised by foreign intelligence. In this case, it would be the Chinese or the Russians. Oops, my dogs are barking. And we have to ask, like, who still gave him the clearance to keep his, or who still decided to give him or continue his clearance, right? If Jay Stratton was instrumental in that decision, we have to also be aware of that, because Stratton has been described as a nut job by, one of his former colleagues. He's a major Skinwalker Ranch, aficionado, fanatic, really. He believes that poltergeists he's got a parasitic poltergeist.
Is
which
he the
follows
one
him around.
who made the parasitic poltergeist claim about his like family and all of that?
I think multiple people have
I
done
mean, most
that.
people have. Okay, interesting. All right, well.
So I mean, all these things about the mental health thing, different variations of that, but like, I think they're all relevant in some way, and so we have to again be aware of that. By the way, somebody in the comments is saying, I mentioned Roswell, and they said, "Mogul balloon, you mean the day after excuse for what happened at Roswell?" But in fact, Mogul specifically was the decades after, revelation by the Air Force. They didn't come out and say Mogul at the time, because that was a classified project for detecting Soviet nuclear blasts in the atmosphere. So, like, I think it makes sense that Mogul was the answer for Roswell, because that was a very classified mission, and at the time they just said weather balloons as a cover for that. So it wasn't actually a day after excuse. Just want to make that clear.
Well, that's a valid point. Yeah, and that's the case with a lot of these secret weaponization programs.
Yes.
Like Louise, I mentioned briefly, like the weaponization of the jet stream when it was first discovered. That was the first thing they did. They kept it top secret, and it was attempted to be weaponized. This is the case every time. And even most recently with the Titanic submersible imploding. I don't know if people recall, but the U.S. Navy, I believe it was, they have those listening devices in there, and they could pinpoint the exact location, and they pass that information on to the Coast Guard almost immediately. They can pinpoint the location of every Russian nuclear submarine in all of the oceans of the world using these sound devices. And that was something they kept secret for decades and decades, because the national security implications, not only of being able to do that, but also of your enemies being aware that you are able to do that, are like immense. And they successfully kept that secret for decades. And, it goes both ways, of course, right? Because knowing where, like, the Soviet nuclear submarine fleet was the foundation of like their deterrent policy, and the Americans having a pinpoint knowledge of every single one of those nuclear submarines would have radically reduced the Americans' concern about starting a nuclear conflict. So these things can be extremely serious, and they can also be kept secret for many, many decades.
And so can you mentioned all that secrecy? So is electronic warfare and countermeasures.
Yes.
Like, I think a lot of this UFO stuff has something to do with that, especially on the East Coast of America, where you've got Cuba, right? And Cuba has a host to Russian, I think now it's a Chinese listening post, ELINT, or electronic intelligence base, where they can pick up a lot of American traffic, electronic traffic, and analyze it. And the balloons that they've launched, the balloons are still like the nemesis of ufologists. They're still tormenting ufologists.
Yeah, haunting them, yes.
But now it's also drones, right? Which are very cheap and expendable, but they're very good at collecting intelligence. So the Chinese are very interested in gathering as much electronic and signals intelligence as possible in preparation for a possible confrontation over Taiwan, which is like a hot issue right now.
Yeah, extremely concerning. So like the summary of what we were just sort of talking about is relating to the claims, the history of kinds of claims of this nature, and the credibility of the individual in question, David Grusch. When I think about trying to this is what I do it in my own head, right? I try to make as strong a case as possible for the UFO truth seeker position, because I want to know the facts. I want to know if they're right. I want to be moving forward on it. So when I think about like David Grusch, the position he's in, the level he's in, everything he knows, it is so distressing to me that he would cite that Italian UFO case, because even
Mhm.
if the public narrative of it being completely debunked is false, and he knows that from classified information, we do not have access to that information. So he should, even if he thinks it's real, he should not be leading with that, because it discredits his entire position to even introduce it. So why the heck would he? It makes no sense to me. And this is the kind of thing that you see in this subject over and over again, is that it's just like, it's inconsistent with their own objectives if they are operating with the information that they're alleging in some respects.
And it also shows that if he can be wrong about that case, then he can be easily wrong about all the others.
Yes. Yes. It's like this. What is that? It's like you bring together 1,000 crappy things, you don't get one good thing. I can't remember exactly how it goes, but it's something like that, right? Like 1,000 bad stories doesn't make one real story, or whatever. So absolutely, like there can be countless stories, and if none of them are verifiable, then it doesn't. I mean, it's interesting, but it doesn't end up getting you anywhere in terms of moving the conversation forward.
Yes. Did you talk about the Doppler aspect? Whoops.
Are you still there?
Yeah, sorry, what happened?
I pressed the back button on my mouse and kicked myself. Okay, I'm happy this is still running. Okay. Anyway,
I was going to ask if you had covered the Doppler aspect.
What is that?
Doppler is, I forget what it stands for. It's like a clearance department for the intelligence and military.
Okay.
Communities. So like they check that if somebody who worked in like the CIA or whatever, the military, they are making some sort of publication for public consumption or something which is not classified, that they don't contain any information or sensitive information therein. So, the Skinwalker at the Pentagon book by Knapp and Kelleher?
Yes.
That actually went through Doppler clearance to check that nothing classified was in it.
Okay.
But
is that because Kelleher has like he was CIA, right? Or it still is potentially?
Kelleher was, yes, he was involved in, I think he was CIA, and he was also involved in ORSAP.
Okay.
And yeah, so like this Doppler procedure or this office, they have to screen these publications. But when they give the go-ahead or the all clear, it doesn't mean that they're endorsing the specific claims in that publication. So if somebody talks about, poltergeists and dino beavers, it doesn't mean that the Pentagon is admitting that that's true. It just means that no classified information made its way into the final, edit.
Right.
And the same thing obtains for Grusch. And some people are saying that because he was cleared, that it means that he's telling the truth. It just means that nothing classified he's actually not saying anything classified. So that in itself gives us pause when he's talking about himself as a whistleblower, because aren't whistleblowers meant to be, spilling the beans, doing something kind of a bit illegal in some cases by, dumping information on the public, which they shouldn't have gotten, legally speaking, even though we could say that ethically they should know about it.
Yes, and you're reminding me so much of the infamous gimbal Navy UFO Tic Tac video thing, where because the Navy approved them for release ultimately after Chris Mellon, it seems, leaked them to the New York Times, it was then sort of widely said, like, the Navy has confirmed this is a real UFO. And it does a disservice to the reality of what is occurring to say that. I understand the compulsion in somebody advocating for this subject to hype the claims. I get it. But
Yeah.
I just want to say very distinctly that by not leaning in heavily to the more conservative presentation of it, if you actually were to lean into the conservative presentation, it is more compelling to people who are not deeply involved in this subject. Like, it should always be the case that the person who is most committed to this subject, they should be the most critical in order to refine it down to the best pieces of evidence that are available. And that is a concern here right now, as we're defining with Grusch, leading with this particular case about a crash recovery that has been so thoroughly, in many respects, like debunked. It just is troubling that it is so consistent with the long history of this subject.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree.
Yes. Okay. I'm gonna. Sorry. Do you have something else? I was just gonna take a look at your notes again briefly.
Uh-huh. Oh, the Soul Foundation.
Oh, yes. Let's talk about that.
Well, I don't know anything about the Soul Foundation, actually. It's on his CV. He describes it as the premier center for research in the natural and social sciences, engineering, and the humanities. That's a pretty extraordinary claim in itself.
It's a big claim.
I mean, wouldn't you think that MIT or the Max Planck Institute would have better claims to such a accolade?
You would think so. I saw Gary Nolan, his lab at Stanford. It's actually like extremely impressive, and he himself, he's extremely wealthy from his patents on all the various things. Actually, let's just very quickly, like Dr. Gary Nolan, he's a scientist at Stanford. He's a very well respected immunologist, if I remember correctly. He's involved in developing treatments for like bone marrow cancers. He's like one of the lead experts in the world on that. I really like that. I appreciate that work. My grandfather died of bone marrow cancer. I think he's doing wonderful things for the world. However, he has a lot of involvement in the UFO subject, and that's quite interesting that he's been heavily involved in trying to get disclosure about UFOs from the government for many years, and now on this whistleblower, David Grusch, a retired Air Force veteran, he is listed on his own CV as the chief operations officer of this foundation founded by Dr. Nolan, and then also Chris Mellon, who was the advocate over many years for UFO subjects, who leaked the UFO Navy videos to the Pentagon originally for that 2017 story. So it's a pretty interesting connection. And if Dr. Nolan is sort of paying David Grusch's paycheck right now, it raises some questions as to what's really going on in my mind.
Yeah. And the other person linked to the Soul Foundation is Christopher Mellon.
Yes.
Who's also been big about this whole disclosure narrative.
That's one way to put it.
But yeah, I mean, again, we have to be careful here because Grusch is involved in this venture. Whatever it is it a for-profit?
I honestly don't know. I have no idea. It's like you said, I have never heard of this. It's interesting for to say it's the premiere. I do love the boldness of it.
Mm-hmm.
It's quite a pitch.
That itself might be a red flag.
Yeah, just these claims. Yes,
Grusch's ability to discern, extraordinary claims. Maybe because like he trusts these people, and some of them do have like the academic, the degrees and so on, like Nolan. So
yeah. But
again, like it does, call into question Grusch's ability to discern extraordinary claims. So there's that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's what we've been saying, sort of like the credentials are impressive. At the same time, it's technically, a logical fallacy, appeal to authority. Like, we need people to bring the information forward so it can be verified, it can be independently checked, replicated if possible. Something I will say for Dr. Nolan, he's a troubling figure in some respects. I do like that, to his credit, when Dr. Stephen Greer was alleging that he had that alien body, Dr. Greer did provide tissue samples to Dr. Nolan, and Dr. Nolan did do the study on it, and he did verify that they were human remains. And even though he is so strongly committed to UFO disclosure, he believes there are non-human intelligences interacting with humanity right now, all of that stuff, he still did toss out that piece of verifiable evidence when he took it in and analyzed it. And you know, I think he should be that should be acknowledged at least, because that's not the standard for most. Well, maybe I won't say, you know, but it's not the standard that we see in this subject frequently.
Well, although I should mention that the time traveler hypothesis has been doing the rounds recently a lot.
I see. And Michael Swords is sort of, I've seen him tweet a bit about it, because he wrote, is that right? He's a professor as well, but of anthropology or something, right?
Michael Masters.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm saying Swords. Swords is the writer. Okay, anyway, Michael Masters. Yes, he's a professor, retired now. It's like sociology or anthropology or something. And he wrote that very famous book where he alleges the most likely explanation for UFOs, on the condition that they're the real objects that exist, are time-traveling humans.
Yes, and also, again, the Magenta story, there's a tie-in there, because that mentions the Nordic aliens.
Oh,
so
yeah.
Those are humans, in other words.
I see. Now, we've talked about this before, Louise, about the very troubling history where we have sort of these fascistic, like racist elements near the start of modern ufology. In the early 50s, we had a lot of the hype revolve around people who were saying they were being contacted by the extraterrestrials on the UFOs. They were almost universally reporting the entities they were in contact with as being kind of consistent with, in a very disturbing way, consistent with the idealized features promoted by like the fascist governments in World War II. Really, really troubling elements. And thankfully, that kind of has moved away from that a little bit. But anytime seeing that side of it be referenced, especially when it's so unnecessary and even harmful to promoting the thing that you're trying to push, that really raises some red flags.
Yeah. I mean, like what do you call it? The stereotype or the archetype of the alien back in the 50s was, and into much of the 60s and 70s actually, was the humanoid, or the human, actually, not even humanoid, but fully human, kind of perfect feature aliens. But then it moved later on into the grays, like I guess during the 1980s and in the 90s as well. Grays were the main one. But now, I don't know, maybe we'll see a swing back to the Nordics.
I would like to hope not, but you know, anything's possible.
Some people actually believe in a kind of a menagerie of aliens. Like, you know, Linda Moulton Howe believes that there's reptilians, grays, and also tall whites.
Right, and I've heard of the mantises are a big one.
Yeah.
And
there's a sort of an element of space opera in this. You know, in space opera, you often have like these different empires or factions of aliens or human, you know, government, political entities or whatever, colonists. And I don't know, that's being projected somehow into the ufology genre.
Yeah, well, you know, it's sort of same old, isn't it? It's crazy.
But I'm not saying Grusch is you know, consciously pushing that.
Yes, no, and that's the troubling part that we've touched on before, is that it's not even necessarily conscious, and people are potentially being manipulated by these undercurrents, not consciously. There are these disturbing elements. I really don't like that he went towards sort of the fascist / Catholic, i.e. Vatican conspiracy as his like lead go-to. Like, it's just so problematic in so many ways. And like I said a few times, so unnecessary by his own perspective, it does not help in any way. So it's very unfortunate that he felt compelled to lead with that kind of piece of information. You referenced briefly there the space opera element. On Reddit the other day, I was seeing people were arguing on, I think, our UFOs about whether Star Trek was inspired by the real Galactic Federation. And then people were like talking about as if like just offhand, like it's as if it's like fact that Gene Roddenberry was in communication with these Galactic Federation people, and that he did just base Star Trek on that, and that Star Trek was part of the CIA program for soft disclosure and all. Like there is such a mythology that's built up around all of this stuff. It's stunning once you start digging into it and you see the depth involved. And that's part of why a lot of academics who study UFOs come at it from a folklore perspective, isn't it? That they're trying to get into the details around how the beliefs are being constructed and transferred and exchanged, and how elder knowledge is transferred to the new generation, and in what ways human psychology influences the development of this huge body of essentially a modern myth at this point about what the origin of these phenomena are. Like we don't know that time travel is real. A lot of the evidence suggests that it may not be. At least we don't have any evidence that it is at this point. What do you think it's like if it's being proposed that flying saucers are real? I get the sense frequently that a lot of these people involved in the subject are like beyond that, right? They're like, yeah, the objects are real. That's obvious. We all know that. Let's move forward. Corbell says that a lot. Yeah. Why then, in your view, why then is the leap then to something that we don't even know is real? Why not stick to physical things that we do know are real if we want to be a bit more compelling?
Because the things that we know are real are not as... how do you tie them to an extraordinary narrative? You have to say, like, you have to take the UFOs or the flying saucers as like a baseline if you want to go beyond them and partake in that kind of conspiratorial universe that the ufologists are, part of. But I mean, did you mention the book? What is it called? It's the Eyewitness Testimony book by Ballister Olmos.
I have not mentioned it, but please do, because it's a very impressive work.
Yeah, let me just pull up the title. I always forget the title. The Reliability of UFO Witness Testimony. You can download it online. Just type it into Google. You can get the PDF. It's a new book it's edited by Vicente Juan Ballister Olmos and Richard J. or W. Hayden. W. Hayden. And it's got like a lot of reports and papers by psychologists. There's a lot by psychologists and cognitive scientists in there talking about how the human mind can be, fooled, or it can embellish, testimony. And there's chapters like looking at specific case studies from the history of the contactees to the abductees and all the other stuff as well. Just individual sighting cases, mass sightings as well, and the mundane explanations. So it's a really great book, but it really goes into how it is that this myth or this legend has developed, and not just from an individual, but from a social point of view as well, because humans are social animals, and we have to understand how legends develop in a social context. What is the social function being served by the legend? What's like the social backdrop? Like, what are the political and cultural events going on? What are the concerns of people at the time? How are they projecting those anxieties and desires into the UFO mythos?
And this author, Ballister Olmos, like, he is not a debunker. Like, from what I understand, like, he takes the UFO subject extraordinarily seriously, has really like dedicated his entire life to it in some respects.
Yeah.
And would you say, Louise, like my take from him is roughly that like he does believe there is a fundamental like phenomenon at the heart of the UFO subject. Is that an accurate representation from what you know?
Maybe previously, but right now he's basically given up on that.
Okay, because of his knowledge that he's developed
Yeah.
around like how the human mind works, he's accepted that it's like sufficient and plausible that each individual observation could be some kind of mundane explanation. Is that
Right. The thing that triggers it, because the thing about human perception, and this is actually talked about nicely in one of the papers by one of the psychologists, human perception is actually a product of both the immediate stimulus and the memories and predispositions of the person. And what ends up as perception is a combination of those. It's like the brain has to sometimes fill in information, especially when it's getting stimuli which are out of the normal bounds of its experience, and then it's going to interpret that through a filter, which is usually what that person's beliefs are. So in this case, it would be things that they've absorbed from the culture, from movies and such. So in other words, alien spaceships, if they see something amazing in the sky, it could just be a satellite re-entry, but many people have reported satellite re-entries as these elaborate spaceships with windows and searchlights and everything. And so the explanation for a lot of this could have its roots in evolutionary psychology as well, because the brain is not a perfect recording instrument. It's something which passes stimuli through a filter, and then that ends up as perception. And the reason that we've got that mechanism is because of survival requirements. So we don't want to be tricked by a leopard, hiding in the bush. If we see a pattern there, it could be danger. So we have to apply some sort of interpretation to it. But that could be an erroneous interpretation. So
Yeah.
I think, yeah.
Yeah, no, you brought up an excellent point with especially like the meteor reentries and how people misperceive them. There is a ex-NASA scientist who, oh my gosh, why is his name escaping me right now? But anyway, he does so much good work on this. I want to pull up potentially one of his things here if I can find it quickly, because he cites an event in Hawaii where a maneuvering UFO was observed by like hundreds of people, and then it was later verified conclusively to be a meteor reentry event. It was a satellite reentry event, so they could exactly name the satellite, the exact location, the exact time. And he basically demonstrated conclusively that hundreds of people can see something that is outside their bounds of normal observation. I've never seen anything that looks like that. And then together, the body of evidence looks extremely compelling because it's hundreds of independent people saying something very similar. But the human mind works very similarly, and we're all in the same culture. So then we're constructing the same thing off of the same stimuli independently. It's like the fact that he has shown that that is possible makes it the most likely in these types of cases. And, that has to always be central, acknowledged, and sort of leaned into, while also recognizing that there are, in rare instances, a truly unique, rare observation of something that is novel and then becomes verified later. So those things can be true, but it's always more likely to be something mundane. Louise, you're a professional scientist, technically in some respects, an academic, a scientist, academic. When
instructor right now, just
instructor. Okay, so when you consider the balance between those things, where does your mind go? Like between, these rare instances, there can be something absolutely novel, unknown to science, that is then discovered. Most of the time, anytime it's observed before it's verified, it has to be acknowledged that it's more likely that it wasn't something remarkable. How do you, as a scientist, sort of like parse those things? How do you maintain open mind to new discoveries while also keeping people's expectations tempered?
Well, we have to acknowledge that there are things in the atmosphere which we still haven't, and this is not controversial, as you well know, that there are things in the atmosphere which are still not understood. So that could be, plasma. And yes, it's James Oberg.
Yes, excellent. Yeah, thank you.
So there's stuff like which we don't understand, which is going on. That has to form part of the background, the priors, if you like, going in. But part of the priors are also the ability for human brains to get tricked by optical illusions. And which, if you think about it, like, is a temperature inversion a weird event? Because in one sense it is, if the person is accurately, in that case, reporting what they saw, which, the output of that would be them seeing something strange, but it's actually not strange in another sense, right? It's not aliens, it's just something atmospheric. So we have to be aware of the range of atmospheric phenomena, and we have to try to calibrate human testimony at that time by, for example, testing the witnesses. So maybe getting them to go to the place again, or trying to remember other features of the landscape. Like, for example, if they said that they said that the object it appeared to be 50 meters in diameter, how accurately can they guesstimate the size of like a mountain nearby or something like that? So we can calibrate the witness to an extent. And also try to do the same with any other witnesses who may have seen the thing. Try to get some sort of physical specifics about it. So like the height, the elevation, etc., from multiple angles, if people in different vicinities saw the thing. Try to gather as much data as possible, basically, is a good starting point. But also be aware that human testimony is going to be sketchy.
Yes, let me just share now this debris reentry event off of Reddit, because it's pretty wild. I would have not known at all what I was seeing. Like, it does, because it's breaking apart and then the individual objects are traveling at the same speed, it does easily look like a single craft with multiple lights on that craft. So I could easily see how something like that could be misinterpreted. Yeah, that's a neat video. I like that.
This is actually a nice example of how the media can lead people astray, because many people's perception of a satellite reentry is that it should just come straight down. But in fact, as James Oberg has noted, these things are traveling at the equivalent of Mach 25. So the fragments are going to stay horizontally moving like for a long time, as we saw just there. Mm-hmm. And people, like, when they're told that it's a satellite reentry, they think that they know that it can't be, because they've got this perception of what a satellite reentry, quote unquote, should be like. But it's completely different to, this is an actual satellite reentry, but it doesn't, it doesn't comport with a lot of people's idea of what it should be.
Yes, yeah. The angle of entry makes it travel so slowly across the sky. And I've just pulled up a PDF presentation from Oberg's website. I have it through the way back because I think the link was broken. But he's talking about the Hawaii, the mothership, classic satellite reentry. And he says majority of posters saw a structured hull with mounted lights. And when I look at that video we just showed, like, I could see that certainly. Like, oh yeah, and it looks very similar to what we just saw. Best verbal descriptions. It's exactly what you're saying. Like, it's really neat to like look into it. And I wouldn't, if I heard that there were hundreds of people independently wrote down what they saw, and it was like a structured craft with portholes that was maneuvering, it would feel impossible that this could be the explanation. And yet it has been conclusively shown that it was the explanation for this particular event. And it's interesting because it's like we said, sort of, there's case after case where it looks so overwhelmingly good from just sort of the face level. And then like Oberg did there, breaking it down and down and down into the specifics, it effectively collapses on its own sort of weight eventually.
Oberg also raises another really good point, which is that he was looking at one of the early cases from Ukraine, in fact, where hundreds saw a Soviet, I think it was a Soviet booster, which had re-entered. And at the time, that wasn't disclosed by the Soviet government. So people didn't know what they were seeing, but many people saw like broadly the same kind of thing. Again, they thought they saw like a spaceship. And the actual explanation wasn't available until much later on. And that's another thing we have to be careful about is that sometimes the actual explanation will not be revealed until later. So
yes,
even then, when we don't understand something, when we think that we've eliminated all the mundane explanations, it could be that there is still a mundane explanation to be discovered.
And it's important to note, it is always more likely that it will be something mundane in any individual instance. Like it's inevitable statistically that that's the case.
Yes.
As unfun as that is. Because I mean, I always, sorry, go on.
No, you go ahead. I
was just going to say, it's always more like, I like mystery. Like, why am I even looking at this stuff? Because I find that there's a genuine mystery here. Like, you know, it's, if it was just all 100% clear cut, there's not much to really get involved with.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I appreciate that part of it, but at the same time, like to the extent that you can eliminate mystery, like I find that more interesting too, because I don't want to just be stuck on a mystery forever. I want to move forward, like maybe move on to another mystery if this mystery gets resolved. You know, I don't want to just be spinning my wheels in a solved mystery. That's just boring.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think I've shared that GIF or whatever a few times of the guy gunning it in his truck in the mud, just like not moving. It's like really feels that way sometimes with this subject, like whatever. But I am happy that Grusch has come forward in the sense that like he is making such explicit claims that he's naming names, naming departments. Like if it is true, this is how it's going to get sort of revealed. So I mean, I'm not against that conceptually, unless he's actually doing real damage to the, you know, national security objectives that are valid objectives and all that stuff. Like maybe this is all a long-term con from you know, like sort of not what Jason Colavito has said, but like in line with sort of the long-term attempts of foreign governments to weaken the authority of the central U.S. government by promoting conspiracy theories that allege abuses of power and things like that. Like that's in line with foreign states' national security objectives. So that's something to be very mindful of. But otherwise, if that's not the origin of this and there are secret programs and stuff, then this is the way to get to them.
Exactly. But somebody in the comment section is they're asking, what about the abduction phenomenon? Why is this not being referenced? I presume they mean referenced in terms of the Grusch revelations.
Yeah, it's not part of the narrative right now at all. That's a good point.
Which, well, I think it's because they don't want to. Eventually, yes, it will be referenced. But I think that right now they just don't want to. I don't know what the term or the analogy is when somebody doesn't want to rock the boat too much to spoil everything else.
Right. Yes.
But I don't know. I think that eventually it will be referenced. I think it's interesting that it hasn't, though, been referenced yet, because Leslie Kean I think she believes in that stuff. She was involved with the hypnotic regression guy. What's his name?
Hypnotic regression. Jacobs or whatever?
No, not Jacobs. The other one. The Intruders.
God, the aerial school phenomenon dude.
Bud Hopkins.
Oh, okay.
Bud Hopkins, who probably did more than anyone else to promote the abduction narrative. Yeah, but I think that right now they're not ready to inject that little sideshow in.
Yeah, and actually, you reminded me there. Leslie Kane, she was asked because she and Ralph Blumenthal, like they did the 2017 article with their
Yeah.
the New York Times writer, but then they also wrote the initial article that sort of introduced David Grusch to the world. That was published in what was it? The not the Drive, the Debrief, and Leslie Kane was interviewed following the publication of that, and she was asked, Mr. Grusch is going on to News Nation saying that there are crashed spacecraft and recovered biologics. Why wouldn't you have mentioned that significant thing in your news article about Grusch's claims? And her response was an interesting statement that was effectively something to the extent of like, well, in order to most effectively push this conversation forward, we felt that that level of claim on an initial article's contained in an initial article, it would make people not be open to thinking about it. It's not the time for it yet. So she kind of like literally spelled out the sort of reasoning that you're suggesting could be at play. And so there's good evidence to suggest that I think you're really onto something there. That is what's going on potentially in some of these people's minds.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a great sign. I mean, it could, if it's all true, then they'll all deserve a big "I told you so." But as it stands, it's not a great look, and it's quite interesting to see that they know that much, but then Kane will also spell that out like that in a way that, like with Grusch, like there are multiple things where it's like, if this person, I mean, and I believe they do, but like, given that they sincerely believe what they're saying, they're acting in a way that by any perspective would harm their purpose. So it's like, is that just bad judgment? Like, I don't want to, I don't know. It's just such a weird thing.
Well, they might just be unaware of how ridiculous they sound.
Yeah, well, you're probably right. That's probably really what it comes down to. If you're sort of, that's the sense I get from a lot of people, right? It's like when people come forward and they're saying like UFOs are X, are Y, like, it ends up sort of from the outside, it's like, well, you haven't even established UFOs are, and now you're saying what they are. Like, let's stick with whether they even exist at this point. So I get that for sure. So Luis, we've gone over a lot of this stuff. I've been going for over 2 hours now. You've been going for a little over or about an hour. Is there anything else that you'd like to touch on before we wrap this up today?
Oh no, I think we got to most of it.
Yes, I agree. I think we really did. This has been a good convo. I appreciate you stepping on, even though you were late. That was really good timing. We ended up going over a bunch of new stuff, so I'm happy that we extended the show. And thanks so much for setting it. Well, we set it up together, so I guess we can each thank each other and ourselves for making it happen.
Thanks.
All right, everybody. I'm going to wrap this up. Luis, could you tell people where your stuff is?
Ufology is corrupt.com. That's the website. And I should have put my Twitter handle up. But anyway, people can find me on Twitter. I usually, right now I'm actually not suspended. I'm locked out because I often get into
the 30th time
firefights with Russia supporters.
Yes,
that really upsets me when people support Russia.
It does raise some questions, doesn't it?
Yes.
So you're suspended right now, but
it'll be back like in a day or two.
In a couple days, people will be able to find you on there. It's is it Luis Satano 83? Is that right? So 83.
Yes.
I think? Okay, good. Okay, and then everybody knows my website, uapstudy.com, and I am at uapstudy on X, formerly Twitter. Also, I guess you're watching it on YouTube right now, but of course, check out our other videos at The Invisible Night School on YouTube. All right, well, Thanks for joining us, everybody. It's been a blast. I'm going to head us onto the closer now. Have a good weekend, everybody.
See you.